Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the last day of the conference. I'd like to recognize you being here at 9 in the morning on a Saturday, on the last day. It definitely shows commitment and interest in the topic. I guess, and I really hope, no, I'm going to stop there. I'm sure, given the quality of the panel too, that we're going to be able to respond to some of those expectations in terms of like what is going to be discussed. No pressure, guys, sorry. My name is Mario Picon. I lead the accountability and citizen engagement practice at the Results for Development, and I am the director of the Leveraging Transparency to Reduce Corruption initiative, a joint venture of Brookings Institution and Results for Development. A conference on challenges and efforts to combat corruption has to necessarily be wide-ranging on the sectors, issues, and geographies explored. IACC ended up grouping a number of very interesting sessions on and around the extractive sector today, for example. Most of them are going to be in the afternoon, and looking forward to have more engaging conversations around those. Although there were a few others involved in the extractive sector earlier in the week. A few of you, I probably saw at that session focused on traders a couple of days ago, where we had representatives from an SOE, Petrobras, and a trader, Glencore. Sessions like that one, and the one that brings us together today, hopefully allow us as a community to understand the complexities of the extractive sector, beyond the role and actions of the large extractive companies, which is where our community has traditionally put most of the attention. In fact, today, we will be discussing at least $1 trillion global market that has arguably not received the consistent attention it deserves, as is the market of suppliers to extractive industries. And this is the case despite some well-known cases like the car wash scandal in Latin America and many others that our panelists will refer to throughout their presentations that have to do precisely with suppliers of goods and services to the extractive industries. I am very excited too and thankful for the invitation to moderate this panel. We have, in fact, a great panel today. We're joined first by Gosia Nowakowska-Miller, local supplier development and community investment specialist at the International Finance Corporation, who has been working 15 years on a small and medium enterprise capacity building and local procurement issues in the oil, gas, and mining sectors, working on enhancing local benefits of the oil, gas, and mining sector investments IFC makes around the world. She advises private sector clients globally on designing and implementing local procurement strategies and community investment strategies. So we are going to hear a lot of that angle during the conversation today. Thank you, Gosia, for joining us today. We also have Rob Pitman, Senior Governance Officer at NRGI, who provides policy advice on extractive sector transparency and governance for resource-rich countries, companies, and international institutions. He currently leads governance programming at NRGI on climate risk disclosure, contract transparency, licensing, and suppliers. Thank you, Rob. We very much look forward, among other things, to hear from the findings of your recent report, Beneath the Surface, the case for oversight of extractive industry suppliers. And finally, we have Jeff, who is directly responsible for me being the moderator today. So all complaints should be directly addressed to Jeff at the following email and phone number. I'm just joking, Jeff. Jeff Geipel is founded Mining Share Value in 2012 and has since acted as managing director. This is an Engineers Without Borders Canada supported initiative that works to improve the development impacts of mining activity in host countries. They work to increase local procurement of goods and services by mining projects to achieve this goal. If you don't know them, they are the guys behind the Mining Local Procurement Reporting Mechanism, LPRM, a set of disclosures that seek to standardize how the global mining industry and host countries measure and talk about local procurement. So thank you, Jeff, for the invitation and for being here to share your perspective on these issues. So here is how I'd like to propose we proceed. We are first going to frame the conversation by highlighting the magnitude of the problem and challenges the community faces in tackling those. Robert will help us set up the conversation with a brief presentation to be followed by comments from Jeff and Gosia to a couple of trigger questions that I'm going to launch for them. Then I will come back with one or two additional questions for the panel, right? Also building on the ones that we're going to be receiving online and from you here. The big value of this kind of events, of these kind of panels, is not only in the richness of what the panelists are able to share with you, but very much in the conversation that we are able to trigger. It is inevitable we're not going to be able to cover every single angle of a very complex issue, and this is where I would like to invite you guys to share a lot of your expertise, case studies, look out at the problem from different angles, so we can have a very active and enriching panel, hopefully. I'm looking forward to learn a lot today from all of you. So maybe, Robert, please feel free to go ahead, and thank you for offering to introduce us to what is at stake. Robert.
Great, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. I've been asked to set the scene and to give the case for the oversight of extractive industry suppliers, which is fortunate given that this is the subtitle of a report that we recently published. I'd like to start with a point about framing. When most of us talk about supply chains in the extractive industries, we usually think about the chain that takes raw materials from the oil well or the mine site all the way through to the end producer. That is not what we're going to be talking about today. We are going to be talking about the suppliers of goods and services to oil, gas, and mine sites. And I think another way of thinking about this as well is that when we think of oil, gas, and mine sites, we think always in terms of the big oil or exploration and production company that owns the rights to explore or exploit those resources. These are companies that you'll have heard of, companies like Exxon, Shell, BP, Chevron, Rio Tinto. And also SOEs, companies like Codelco or Gazprom or Petrobras. But these companies are really only the companies at the top of the project, and also working on the project are a myriad number of suppliers. These companies range from massive multi-million-dollar conglomerates such as Schlumberger, or Halliburton, all the way through to smaller specialized companies that provide a certain service or good, through to local companies. So why is it so important that we need to be thinking about extractive industry suppliers? To put it very simply, these companies are on the receiving end of a huge amount of money. Using industry data from Rystad, we calculated that 2/3 of every dollar spent in the extractive industries goes towards suppliers. And that totals as much as $1 trillion a year for the upstream alone, pre-pandemic. At this scale, spending on extractive industry suppliers has huge ramifications for the costs for extractive industry projects, and by extension, the taxable income that governments can receive. It's also a massive opportunity for local content if you can direct some of that money towards local suppliers and supply chains and employment. At the same time, this is a honeypot for corruption. And to give you a sense of how extreme that is, we looked through FCPA corruption cases, and you see there that extractive industries are the most prevalent of any of the sectors. And then within those extractive industry cases, we saw that over half involved suppliers. We then analyzed 40 of these cases to get a clearer sense of the topography of extractive industry supplier corruption. And doing this, we saw some interesting trends regarding the companies and regarding the companies involved. So regarding the countries, you see that a full range of countries are involved. So we see host countries that are countries essentially that have very established extractive sectors with a lot of examples of corruption. So countries like Venezuela, Nigeria feature. We also see frontier jurisdictions feature, countries like Ghana, Mauritania. And finally, we also see wealthy countries feature. There are extractive sector supplier corruption cases in the UK and in the USA, for example. In terms of the companies involved, we see the full remit of extractive industry suppliers involved, from those very, very big companies all the way through to the small, local, specialized companies. And one thing that I'd really like to highlight here is, and I think that you can't really ignore when you're looking at supplier corruption in the extractive industries, is the role that SOEs play, state-owned enterprises. State-owned enterprises feature in almost the majority of extractive industry supplier corruption cases. And there are certain vulnerabilities that make this so. There's weak oversight of SOEs, but SOEs are also able to influence private sector procurement processes in sort of a varied number of ways. They are able to, sometimes they are the people purchasing and buying from suppliers themselves, but they are also often regulators and they often also play a role setting policy. And finally, as their role in joint venture partners in extractive industry projects, they sit on the project committees, various project committees, and are able to sort of direct procurement spending in that way. And the fact that they have all these different roles, and in some cases they can be playing all these roles at the same time, makes it very, very hard to pinpoint the exact sort of node of influence that SOEs play in procurement processes in the extractive industries. So I'd like to now move on to outline sort of four main sort of motives and patterns that we see in extractive industry supplier corruption. These are, in short, that suppliers themselves pay bribes. Can you? No. Okay. Suppliers yeah, there's a dog here. This is great. We like diverse participation from humans and non-humans. So anyway, there are four different sort of main motives that I was just about to describe relating to supplier corruption. First is that suppliers themselves pay bribes in order to gain some sort of benefit. The second is that suppliers are used to channel bribes. Third, we see that political actors essentially get involved in the supplier procurement process for their own benefit. And finally, we see suppliers trying to tilt the playing field to their own benefit. So they're abusing the politics. And I'll just go in and provide a couple of examples for each of these. Firstly, on suppliers paying bribes. I think an example that just illustrates just how big these cases can be is the case of Geipel in Algeria. According to SEC allegations, the company paid up to 200 million euros in bribes in order to receive pipeline deals worth up to $10 billion or euros. So that's just shocking in terms of how large the numbers are. Next, looking at how suppliers are used to channel bribes. The reason this happens is I probably don't need to explain this at a corruption conference, but this is essentially a way to put distance between the bribe payer and the person receiving the bribe, and providing some plausible deniability. I think that probably the most famous case here in recent years involves the Monaco-based oilfield services company, Unaoil, which described itself as an industrial solutions company for the oil, gas, and mining sector, but was described by The Age in an Australian newspaper as the bribe factory. Allegations against Unaoil have implicated a further 11 oil field services companies. Then thinking about how supplier contracting processes are abused by political elites for their own benefit. The way this happens, I think you can think of this as happening in sort of three ways. Suppliers are used essentially to channel money towards political campaigns, as was noted in the famous Petrobras bribery scandal, the Lava Jato scandal in Brazil. They're used to dole out patronage, but they're also just used to make a bit of money on the side. I think an interesting way that political elites get involved in supplier corruption cases is when they use regulatory approvals to pressure private sector companies to spend money in certain ways. And this is often taking advantage of poorly drafted processes that allow a lot of discretion on the part of government officials. Local content is an area where this often happens, and there's a fascinating example involving Halliburton in Angola. And this Halliburton example also points to another way that political elites get involved, and that's by taking part in the sector by proxy. In this Halliburton example, the company that Halliburton were encouraged to purchase from was a company that was owned by a friend and neighbor of the government official, and who also had previously been an employee at Halliburton. Regarding suppliers and essentially controlling the political process and tilting the field towards their own products. This is essentially the issue of political financing and gets to the murky point of legalized corruption. I think an interesting case here, though, actually comes from Alaska, where in 2011, two former Alaskan legislators were sentenced in federal court after it turned out that they'd received bribes from VECO Corporation for legislative measures that would benefit VECO. So I've shown you all sort of the scale and how prevalent this issue is and how much it's worth. So if it's such a big issue, what's being done? And I think here there are two sort of main stories. The first is a negative story. The fact is that these corruption enforcement mechanisms are finding so much corruption, but at the same time, very few companies, governments, are actually doing anything to shed light on extractive industry suppliers. Most supplier procurement processes are hidden from public view, and there's very little information about who actually ends up winning these contracts. And when governments do get involved, as I described, they often allow themselves to get involved with laws that provide too much discretion. We see local content laws in particular where the definition of local is very, very poorly defined. And what's worse is that basic monitoring information, such as targets and then the data collected against those targets, isn't published in many countries. And finally, it's very, very unclear how SOEs are involved in extractive industry procurement, and that remains the case. But there is a positive story. Some companies, governments, and even civil society organizations are stepping up and taking steps to shed light on this important issue. And I'm just going to run through a few sort of examples that I've found quite hopeful. The first, let's get over this slide. Help you. Okay, I think the first involves a company called Oyu Tolgoi, a massive Rio Tinto operated mine in Mongolia. They have this incredibly open procurement system that lists all of the contracts that they've given for the underground mine, lists names of all of the companies that receive those contracts, but then it also provides emails for those companies. And this is important from an accountability perspective, but it's also important from a local content perspective, because it means then that local suppliers have a contact, somebody they can follow up with to find out about further opportunities down the line. And that helps sort of, I think, build sort of social license at that local level. The UK have developed an incredible tool that now every oil and gas company operating in the North Sea has to follow. And this is called the Energy Pathfinder. Companies have to put up upcoming tenders online. Then they have a page with all of the latest contracts where they provide the names of the contractors. They provide information about the size of that contract, the purpose of the work, and then, again, a contact at that company. And so it's an absolutely fantastic tool. And you know, one of the reasons that they were building this tool wasn't actually for corruption purposes, but was because they wanted to sort of break down sort of the walls around these procurement processes, so that you know, any old sort of company in Scotland and the UK could get involved and work out how to supply to these companies. The Lebanese Petroleum Administration has also started publishing supplier information of the people awarded contracts in their petroleum sector. And what they do that goes beyond anyone else is they provide information about the beneficial owners of the companies receiving contracts. International standards are also being developed. I think here probably the most extensive is the mining local procurement reporting mechanism, which Jeff is going to be talking about. And which I am an evangelist of as well. It's a really great standard and helping to raise standards elsewhere. But we're also seeing movement within the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. Some countries are really innovating in this initiative, and one that I think deserves a special mention is Senegal. And then for government and SOEs, there is always the Open Contracting Data Standard that they can borrow from. And the GRI also has standards here. Finally, on this problem that I've flagged so many times on SOEs, there is guidance being produced here. And one piece of guidance that I just want to highlight was something that NRGI put together, working with a broad selection of stakeholders, put together anti-corruption guidance for partners of state-owned enterprises, so the private sector partners of state-owned enterprises. So just some final passing thoughts. Extractive industry suppliers get big contracts, but they have a low profile. There's a lot at stake for citizens, consequences for costs, government revenues, local content, and corruption. Transparency is an important first step. There's a sad story here, but we do see some progress. I think actually one thing here is that all of these processes at the moment tend to be sort of originating at the country and company level. So we really need to sort of work on coordination to make sure that the data being produced speaks to each other and is easy to use. And so that's it. I would encourage you to go and take a look at our report in which we go into all of these questions in a lot more detail. But I want to say thank you very much and pass on to my colleagues and for what's going to be hopefully quite an exciting discussion.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you, Rob, for that great introduction to the issue, to the key challenges, framing our conversation for today. Before I go with some specific questions to some of the other panelists, maybe highlighting 3 areas or 3 thoughts here based on what Rob shared with us that may be helpful to motivate the conversation later. And maybe, let me propose 3 themes so you can think also about your comments, your questions. But of course, if you have other issues that you would like to raise during in probably in about 15 minutes, please, absolutely, please make notes and share them with us when we have that space. But there are 3 things that I wanted to highlight here. Rob talked about the motives behind this. What are the drivers? Where is it that you see the corruption in this particular market? And certainly that may sound familiar for many other areas in which you may be working, right, or have worked in the past, related or not to extractives. I guess that there's a discussion there about the normalization of many of these practices across the board and in so many geographies, both in the north and in the south, right? Despite our best efforts and despite a lot of very important initiatives that have triggered action. But the question is how much these practices are entrenched and normalized sometime, where all the action to build more initiatives, standards, regulation ends up being somehow bypassed, right? There is some learning by doing some adaptation of people that are willing to go through these risks, right, of committing a corruption act, that they believe that it is still worth trying and doing it. So what is behind there? Thinking a bit more about that. Second, there are a bunch of different initiatives and efforts to bring about more transparency. The question is who is using this information? Are we all using this information? Are we actually getting the access to this information? Do we know that information is out there? And if we don't know here in Washington in an anti-corruption conference, probably a lot of our peers and partners in countries don't. And third theme that I guess that is very important for us to discuss later is related to collective action, which has been really percolating a lot of the discussions during this week. So these are the challenges. There is progress. What is missing? How do we make together work all these efforts to work better, to have actually better results? What is missing in the system out there, in the anti-corruption, in the governance system, that could actually make all these efforts stronger and more effective? Just 3 themes that I would like to propose upon the panel and the public for later on, for the second phase. But now let me really quickly go to Gosia, because what we wanted also is to get a bit more of the expertise of each one of the panelists here. And I have a couple of questions for Gosia, but my computer just turned off. So let me just go on. Gosia, because of your particular experience, right, at IFC and the kind of work that you are doing, I was wondering, right, there are obviously very high expectations, linked to local content and opportunities for local businesses in the supply chains of large corporations, right? How do companies manage these expectations and ensure transparent processes and systems, right? These whole things, a new extractive company comes to our region or near our community, right? There are a whole process of discussion and negotiation, jobs, contracts for local providers. Some of local providers move to the area even, right? How to manage those expectations and maintain transparency standards up and high.
Thanks, Mario. Thanks, Rob, for putting the context. This was really great. So as Mario introduced me, for those of you who are new who entered after the introductions, my name is Gosia Nowakowska-Miller, and I'm from the IFC, the International Finance Corporation, which is a part of the World Bank Group. But I work, so IFC invests in large companies across the globe in developing countries, but I work in a team that provides advisory services to those large corporates, and we in particular work with the companies to help them on their strategies for community investment, and local supplier development, and many other topics, mainly related to community and stakeholder issues. So hence my area of focus is not going to be very macro level, but much more on the ground with related to communities. And so these expectations, Mario, that you're asking about, the companies that we work with in these, particularly the developing countries, so that's where my experience is from, is, everyone wants jobs, everyone wants contracts. And of course, these contracts are not going to be the big ones like the Halliburton contracts, but nevertheless, there's challenges. And the first one is the perception that the process of selection of who wins a contract is not transparent. And this is whether the government thinks this way, whether the local communities thinks this way. And so the companies are always struggling because many of these companies think they're, sort of best in class, that their policies, their procedures, like you saw the example of Oyu Tolgoi in Mongolia, many of these companies willing to make these investments in these developing countries have systems in place. They have robust procurement policies, they're on their websites and so on, but once you're on the ground level, people don't maybe trust that they're actually followed, or they don't understand how they play out. And so part of the challenge is the gap in information, where the companies aren't sharing enough information on how the process works. How do they go about making decisions? How do they ensure competitiveness in that selection process? How do they minimize single sourcing so that those, even a $50,000 contract here in the US in a developing country like Guinea, that's a huge contract for a small business to win a $50,000 contract. And those are single sourced. I mean, there's no surprise, but where you need to, with local content and this type of local supplier development, we are trying to work with our clients to develop these strategies on how to get those contracts to those local businesses and not only to the large multinational operators. There's the word unbundling for any of you who work in procurement and local content. This word is very, very commonplace, and so it's about breaking down contracts so that you can have smaller and smaller and smaller components so that these smaller local businesses can actually compete for these contracts and deliver them successfully. But then very often they come under the threshold of single sourcing, so then you have the issue of, well, I don't need to make this competitive because it's within the restriction, and so there's this constant battle of increasing competitiveness, increasing transparency in the selection process, but then also complying with the procurement practices of a procurement officer in a company who wants to do things efficiently at the lowest cost possible, and really with trusted service providers who they know will deliver and they won't have issues. So this level of and then this comes back to the expectations, I think, which puts a lot of pressure on the companies, and sometimes the expectations are good motivators. Sometimes the expectations are coming from influencers, as Rob sort of hinted at some of the examples, where these influencers who have these very high expectations may not have the best intentions themselves, because when you really dig deeper into why do they have these issues against, we don't trust why you selected this company A over company B, and you realize they don't really understand the technicalities of the contract or the delivery of a contract, you start realizing, the owners of company B who didn't win the contract, they seem to be very closely connected with the person who's making a lot of noise about the transparency of the procurement process. But nobody will say that out loud unless you kind of do your own digging. So hence these databases that Rob was showing are so amazing to start putting out there. Who are the owners behind these companies? Why is somebody so interested in this company winning a contract and is so irritated that this company won a contract? There's always some sort of curious or dubious reason behind a lot of these expectations and these pressures that are coming from all sides. And so I'm not saying any one party in this whole mix is the good guy or the bad guy, because there's always challenge. Everyone's sort of trying to keep information to themselves for various reasons, but and so hence these initiatives like the local procurement, LPRM, local procurement reporting mechanism, and this encouragement even by EITI for more disclosure, more transparency, more open data is so critical, because it puts people just on to task. You have to be clear on why you chose someone, and so it helps that conversation. And in many places, just as a closing, an additional thought before I end, you know, sometimes these practices and in procurement, it's challenging because there's certain ways of doing business in countries, and then a multinational comes in and they want to change that way of doing business because I'm the multinational, I don't do business this way, I have my standards. But in certain countries, giving gifts is very acceptable. It's actually expected, and it's completely normal. It's a normal process of business. Nobody looks down upon it. It's not seen as suspicious. It's just you submit a bid, you kind of give a little gift to go alongside it to confirm your interest, let's say. But a multinational can't accept those gifts. And so many companies we've worked with, of course, try to ensure that they're implementing their, procurement systems like Ariba and all these sort of more mechanized. So they take away the human factor so that there isn't a desk that you bring a tender or a bid to and hand it over for submission, but it's all electronic. And that has its benefits, of course, because you take away that transaction for the gifting potential. And but in developing countries where I'm working and I'm trying to encourage the local businesses to compete for contracts and have opportunities, they don't always have access to the internet. They don't always understand these systems. They've never dealt with anything like this. So then you have a whole new challenge on top of the challenge of just trying to get them to submit a bid. Now you have to explain the whole process. So the desire for the transparency and the openness is amazing, but it takes a long time, and many steps and baby steps need to happen along the way to get to what we're all trying to achieve. So I'll end it there, but there's so many things we can talk about.
Absolutely, Gosia, and again, thank you so much for sharing that. I mean, for talking about these examples that we have here in the past, right? Like the discussion about like a particular use, for example, around gifts, etc. Also, like the challenges that happens for different companies, right? Like coming from abroad and trying to like adapt, right? Like or implement many of the standards that they come from, that they bring, in any case. And then just trying at the same time to make things work at the local level. So this is a problem in which we obviously have to look at all the different players and their role in building this particular culture or practice, right, and happening. I actually wanted to move probably to Jeff to ask you actually a very specific question about corruption in local procurement. Jeff, if you had to frame the conversation from your point of view based on your experience too, how does corruption undermine actually the goals of increasing the local procurement of goods and services by extractive industry companies in particular in the host countries?
Great, thank you so much for all coming this morning. We focus on local procurement because it's the biggest payment made by mining companies and oil and gas companies. It's usually around the same scale. The difference between Canada and Australia, in terms of being economically developed from mining, and countries that are not, is largely a lack of backward linkages, this lack of local procurement from companies into local suppliers. And corruption is not only a means, or procurement is not only a means of corruption in the way that Rob described in terms of paying bribes via overpriced service contracts, for example, but corruption undermines the goals of local content and these efforts to make backward linkages. So I just want to give a couple stories. I guess I can't really avoid saying the country's name just because of the specifics, but essentially we're doing a project in Ghana right now with GIZ, and we're trying to align several mining companies to align their procurement processes to help local suppliers, to kind of pool demand for local suppliers' particular products, or have them all trying to use the mining local procurement reporting mechanism so that we're all kind of using the same information. But what we keep coming up against is corruption in a very subtle way in terms of why we can't target particular goods and services. So 2 examples. One is that in Ghana, they import so much of the food that goes into the mining camps, right? And, the delicious jollof rice from Ghana is almost all made of imported components, tomato paste from Asia, rice from abroad. So we thought, well, an obvious option here is chicken, right? There's a lot of chicken being eaten at the camps. If all the mining sector could agree, we're only going to buy Ghanaian produced chicken, here's an opportunity. Well, everyone then said to us, well, you do know that the largest importer of chicken is the brother of the president. So, this kind of choice of which products can be focused on keeps coming up. Another example from the same project is there's this amazing road of mining companies that basically goes from Takoradi on the coast into the western region, where there's about 10 mine sites that if they could pool the demand for particular products, the opportunity to create economies of scale would be so massive and be very, in the grand scheme of things, very easy to target those goods and services. But the road itself is horrendous. And of course, the road being poor quality undermines everybody along that road in terms of their competitive business. It increases fuel costs, it increases delivery times. It makes, for example, things in some ways often cheaper to import directly to the port and then to the mine site instead of using the road. And so we talked to one mining company, and they a manganese company, and I guess with manganese you just blow it up, put it on trucks, and take it to the port. There's not a lot of processing going on. And we said, well, why would you use these trucks on this horrible road to transport your manganese to the port? And they said, well, there is a rail line. It's hardly used. I think they said they used about 20% of their transport was done by rail. But they said, well, the reason why nothing happens is because the local politicians own the haulage companies, right? So we're seeing that not only can procurement be a means of corruption itself completely undermines the potential for developing countries, and for that matter, developing regions in advanced countries, to target supplying opportunities. And these are massive contracts. As Rob alluded to, a mining company, a typical large-scale mine site will spend $200-300 million on procurement of goods and services. So that is all money that flows out of the country if it's all being imported goods, for example. So that's just a couple of examples, I think, of how corruption is both a means and a result of procurement of goods and services.
Thank you very much, Jeff, for that overview. And so let me just go back to you also, because maybe for the benefit of everybody, we have been talking a bit about tools and some efforts to bring some order to this mess, right? But it's like, maybe you can tell us a bit more about the mining local procurement reporting mechanism in particular. I mean, like how it came about to be created, and how is it going in terms of its application?
So I started Mining Shared Value in 2012, and we had to sort of do a baseline of the issue. How is the industry doing? I'm Canadian Engineers Without Borders Canada is in a country with lots of mining companies. So just sort of to, I guess, start looking at things, we looked at reporting. At the time it was called CSR reporting. Now it's called ESG reporting, but it's the same thing. Reporting by companies and what they were talking about, and we looked at whether they had procurement mentioned, did they provide statistics, did they mention a supplier code of conduct, for example, and we made a checklist, And this checklist kind of put all the companies on a checklist and said, this company provides these 5 pieces of data, this company provides 0. And it came out. And what happened was companies started reaching out to us and saying, well, we'd like more check marks. How do we get more check marks on your checklist? And we said, well, for example, you don't provide any data on local procurement, therefore you didn't get that check mark. And so one company said, well, how do we do that? I said, well, you needed to make a category for local suppliers and divide up your spending and report that. And they said, well, how do we define local? We help them do that. So we recognized there early that reporting itself and transparency was actually creating a push, an incentive, a carrot for companies to improve the performance. And so that company then started measuring their local procurement for the very first time and now is doing better on that issue. Eventually, someone from GIZ, from the Extractives for Development program, came across this report and said, why don't we try to make a standard out of this? So they commissioned us to make the mining LPRM. It took, we did about 1.5 years of consultation with industry. We had a global steering committee. We did some extended consultations in Mongolia, Mali, and Albania, sort of a real range of different mining types. And we made this tool. And essentially what the tool is it's really not complicated. It's just, we would like you to provide this information by mine site level as to what you're doing. So what are your local procurement processes? Do you have a policy? How much money is going to local suppliers, national suppliers, and international suppliers? It's modeled on the Global Reporting Initiative in terms of being, again, a set of disclosures, and we say that if a company is reporting in accordance with the LPRM on a given mine site. So it's a set of questions, and then how companies report it varies. So this is New Gold, which I think is probably the best example of a company using it. We have 12 now using it. New Gold makes this really amazing index at the end of their ESG report, which basically says, here's our 3 mine sites, two mine sites in Canada, 1 in Mexico, and they say, here's the answer to each question. So you can't really see that on that one, so I'll just zoom in on one. So it just shows you in great detail by mine site how they're doing things. So for example, who is the contact person, for example, who is in charge of local procurement? Do major contractors, tier 1 suppliers like ECPM contractors, large engineering firms, do they have to do local procurement? So again, it really creates transparency. Right now, what we're trying to do is move this data from the ESG reports. We're trying to now move that into more accessible formats on the ground. So we're working with the idea of making kind of single site-specific LPRM indexes that could then be shared out by PDF, by WhatsApp, and everything else. So that's kind of how the tool works. We have 12 mining companies using it, so in terms of progress, and then I think we hope to add another 6 or so this year. I guess the main point I would say in terms of going back to that point about driving performance and increasing transparency, if companies have to report for the very first time on a topic, it makes them have to put in a back-end system. And so the very first mining company who adopted the LPRM is called Ivanhoe Mines, and they didn't have a supplier code of conduct. And so at the time, and the 400 disclosures of the LPRM ask you, how do you do supplier due diligence? So they said, well, we better make a supplier code of conduct. So again, because they had to report it, they had to put a system in place. And that's that's why transparency works. That's why we can improve performance both on local procurement as an economic development issue, and also deter corruption by getting this information out into the world.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I would like, in general, to thank every one of you for the approach that you have given to the conversation, focusing very much on examples, which I think is very important to bring many of these discussions that may feel at sometimes very technical, in the end to life, right? One thing that I was reflecting before me coming over here today, actually I had a great conversation with an Uber driver, about corruption during the time of Gaddafi in Libya, and his perception and his view on it as an Ethiopian immigrant actually in Libya, because everybody was going to Libya because there was so much money and so much work, right? And then also thinking about, for example, in Peru, right now, where I come from, recently, the president fell, right, was ousted. after all this evidence, like blunt evidence of corruption, that basically was a complete new system, a new group of players set up to seize a number of contracts from government, particularly at the local level, within 3 weeks. So there is actually evidence of corruption already happening within 3 weeks of the new government with completely no experience in the political landscape in Peru, or not really own political party, and they had the system basically in 3 weeks. And what this became is in a way like a democratization of like the opportunity to actually get benefits like from this system of goods and services, right? Procurement. How fast this is that this can happen. And then you start thinking at all the different new players and companies, small companies that were formed in the months before, like this government started. Like, I guess that there is like almost an expectation that this is what needs to happen, right? To be able to respond to a particular history or a particular system, or because that's the way that things work around here. I mean, like, and probably that is one of our most difficult challenges, right? Because how do we not only through sticks, right, like, but also through carrots, like, are we able, right, to actually change that subculture, if you want, right? Like, of many people that probably they are excellent, good parents at their own house, right? But they feel actually that they have this opportunity and they have to seize it on all the different players, states, businesses, right? And even in sometimes civil society, right? So, like, I just wanted to challenge you to have this conversation, right? Like, not only understand the magnitude and the technical implications and backstory of like the issue, right? But also how this reflects, right? Like how things have been operating over time. And it's like, how much are we able and what else can we do actually to change that particular landscape? So, in the beginning, I was trying to motivate with 3 themes, right? Like, one is the discussion about like how do we change this status quo, right? Almost this expectation that these things should happen, or like that is how things work around here. Second, there is a bunch of tools and progress. We have seen it, right? And that has been actually very effective, depending on the angle that you take to the story. Is that enough? Can we do more? Are actually people that need to use this data, this information, using it? Can we do more about that? And the third is like looking ahead. How can we work together better to actually make a larger and larger dent on the problem over time? I would like to open, in any case, the floor to a conversation about this in the minutes that we have. And please, also the panelists, if you feel that you can react to some of these thoughts and motivation, go ahead in any case. Any questions from the audience? Oh, fantastic. I'm going to just pass a microphone, and I'm just going to move. Oh, there's a microphone standing there. Will you be okay, please? Is it working?
Oh, it's
yeah.
better. Okay.
Can you tell us where you come from, please?
Yes, I was about to say it. François Valérian, Transparency International. So many thanks for your interventions. I think we all measure that monitoring, procurement, suppliers, contracts, tenders is very important. Now, there is also a whole area of corruption linked to the extractives that involves partners of the companies, but does not involve contracts or tenders. And that's the whole area of the equity partners of the extractive corporations. So those partners are not being recruited through tenders or contracts. They are minority partners in subsidiaries of the corporations, or they are partners in the exploitation of a mine or a field. And that's a corruption that is being entered into by the corporation in a very purposeful manner. It's on purpose, so it comes from the head of the corporation. And when you look at the reports that are being published by the big listed extractive corporations, you see that there are differences between the corporations. Some of them only have 100% owned subsidiaries, and others of subsidiaries in which they have minority partners, and those partners are not being disclosed, and very often those subsidiaries happen to be registered in interesting jurisdictions such as the Cayman Islands, Bermuda, British Virgin Islands, etc. So why wouldn't we ask from the companies to disclose the beneficial owners of all their equity partners in the big, thick annual reports that they are publishing? Thank you very much.
It's fantastic. Thank you so much for introducing that in the conversation. Any quick reaction from the panel on that particular issue?
Yeah, I mean, that's an important issue and an important question. The main response I would give there is that in the EITI standard, it is required that companies publish the names and beneficial owners of joint venture partners. But I think ultimately this is an issue that requires sort of investigation, and when that happens, sort of people need to translate that investigation into sort of public campaigns and awareness raising to sort of hit at the political levels in order to address those problems. But yeah, thanks very much for that intervention. It's an important issue.
Thank you for that. And it's like, Jeff, something on that account.
I just want to add that in addition to this being an avenue for corruption to keep equity partners kind of silent and difficult to find, it's also just a giant pain for local suppliers to understand how to access procurement opportunities. In a lot of cases, mining companies have a different name in the country than their parent company. And so if you're a supplier and you want to look up, for example, the procurement processes of a given mine, you can't even find out the name of the mining company that owns the mine. And I've seen this firsthand with suppliers in Zambia, for example, who say, I want to supply this mine, and they actually don't even know who is the owner. Even though it's quite a large-scale mine. It's not like it's a small mine, but just the confusion around different names of subsidiaries and the parent companies is a practical barrier as well to procurement opportunities. So just add that.
Yes, please.
Since I work for the IFC and this relates to investments, so I think a lot of this information also, when you have a public company versus a private company, so certain ones will have expectations on what's listed and the detail of information that's shared publicly, but then it trickles down to also where they're getting their financing from. And so, of course, if they're coming to the IFC for financing, we have to do integrity due diligence on all of the owners of the subsidiary, the parent company, and then the project company, and make sure there's no politically exposed people that are part of the board, the actual owners, and so on. And surprises come up, things our IDD teams really dig deep, and so they will find who's been a minister, who's been in positions where they have influence and currently have it, and then there's companies where sometimes you just can't find something, and we have to let that opportunity go because it's just too much of a reputational risk to be associated, even if financially it makes a lot of sense. So it's a really important topic. I totally agree. Thanks for bringing that up.
And definitely, by the way, stresses the importance of the quality and the need to regularly update these kind of beneficial ownership registries, which they have their own challenges, right? As we all know. This is fantastic. The next question we have, yes, you have the microphone, and then I'll come to you, ma'am. Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you. My name is Neha Wadekar. I'm a journalist based in Nairobi, Kenya. So this question is directed to Jeff, but everybody really. So the LPRM and the story about how many companies are using it and starting to implement systems is great. But for many of the companies operating in these countries, it's more profitable to keep doing things the old way rather than being transparent and using this new way. And we have companies like Glencore and others who we know would prefer to cut corners and pay bribes and do the wrong thing in order to get the outcomes they want because the profits are so high. So why do we think voluntary mechanisms are effective, especially when the biggest companies at the top and the governments themselves are benefiting and complicit in corruption?
Jeff.
Great. Thanks very much for the question. I think on this particular issue, it's a bit complex. I don't actually think that most mining companies want to increase local procurement because it's cheaper. It keeps supply chains local, increases resiliency. So I wouldn't say that most mining companies have a real opposition to this. They do have an opposition to transparency in many cases, but again, even there, I would almost say it's because they just don't like reporting. They don't like sharing information. It's not at least in this topic, there's not that many cases of large-scale mining companies doing really problematic things via procurement on purpose. It's because of their. It's the setting that they're in that they are pressured to do so. Most mining companies would prefer not to engage in this because it's a giant reputational risk. But what I would say is two things. One is that the mining LPRM is a voluntary standard, but you can make it, for example, a requirement. Right now, we're actually talking to two governments right now, but making this a requirement. So even though I agree that we need mandatory standards, these sort of soft law standards can become hard law standards. But I guess the second point I would say is the bigger challenge that I think we face in this topic is quarterly pressures. The reason why we can't get mining and oil and gas companies to significantly increase local procurement and engage in supplier development, increase their transparencies, because in the next quarter, local procurement will cost more. That's the main barrier. And even though mining companies will tell me, we'd love to work on supplier development for 5 years because eventually having a local producer of a given product in the country will save us money and increase our supply chain resiliency, we can't justify this to our shareholders right now. So I think that just for context, I think that is probably the bigger barrier to this. But I absolutely take your point, and we do need more mandatory standards. And I think these kind of issues should become mandatory via things like the EITI and, for that matter, legislation.
Thank you very much for that question. Any quick reaction, Rob?
Yeah, I'd just like to jump in. I mean, I don't know if corrupt contracting is definitely not cheaper, because you're paying more because you've got to pay for the corruption as well, and it's while it may be sort of easier in the short run, in the long run, yeah, those costs add up. And also the other thing in the long run is that you end up with sort of a much less sort of diversified range of suppliers. And when you have a sort of less and diverse and more concentrated market, less to choose from, there's less competition. That drives prices up too. The other side of corruption and how it increases costs here is that you then also have the risks of environmental, social, all sorts of other sort of fallout from the way that your contractors are behaving, and that's more expensive to manage in the long run. So I would push back on the idea that it's cheaper. I think that the systems that you've got to get in place to get over the hump, that requires an investment, but in the longer run, I think you're saving money. But yeah, you're also fighting against sort of local context, so that's another question entirely. So,
please.
My name is Maria Cristina.
Is it working? Maybe use this.
I just turned it off.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
My name is Maria Cristina. I'm from
Hello.
Brazil. I have a 501 Together for Earth. Basically, I want to ask you, how can we solve the situation in Amazonia, where you have gold, stones, uranium, niobium, everything being like going somewhere, and the problem is that it's not a big company. It's small people, and sometimes even the indigenous people are involved, but they are involved in a way of they're kind of slaves of someone. So there is human rights in the middle, there is climate change in the middle, and there is all this gold and stones and everything and going away, sometimes through frontiers. Sometimes they smuggle it from Brazil through Venezuela and then they sell. How do you solve a situation like this? Because it's not a big company, but it's small pieces.
I'm smiling because this is like the $1 million question of how do you tackle artisanal mining? And I think many people have tried in very many ways, and I am definitely no expert, but I know IFC has, the World Bank has, and they go through moments where they shy away from it, and then they get in deeper and they try to advise governments. But from my limited experience, it's in many of these countries, as you mentioned, it's not an indigenous people issue, but the governments are really holding the reins a lot of times. It looks very informal when we look at it, but it's a very formal, very well organized network and system of how these artisanal mines operate across the globe, and many of them are local businesses. Many of them are coming from outside, but they're artisanal, so they look informal, but they're international investors in this, and they do pay. They do provide revenues to the government, and so the government has very minimal incentives to stop this work happening because the government benefits from it, even though environmentally it's a catastrophe in many cases. And then there's the broader community, the broader public doesn't benefit as much as possible because the influencers, the well-connected people benefit from this. But yes, between the environmental and the social issues, oh goodness, there's so many things to tackle, and I wish someone could find an answer to how to address this, but I definitely don't. But yeah, we could talk. That's a whole nother session.
The only thing I would add is just, there are a bunch of sort of supply chain due diligence standards. Sort of the OECD has one, the EU has stuff, and things are constantly being evolved in this area. And that's sort of looking at the end of these supply chains. Can you have a certification scheme? So sort of tracking where do the minerals come from, what are the standards, and then you're putting sort of scrutiny on these sort of end producer companies, whether they be like a car company or whatever, Apple, and those companies sort of care about this, and tying it to their reputation can sort of eventually trickle back. But it's
consumer.
Yeah.
Can I have a quick show of hands of people interested in asking a question or making a comment?
A round of questions, like 2 or 3 together.
2 or 3 together, maybe?
Online questions, but they were emailed to you.
All right, perfect. So it's like we had 2, 3, right? And we'll do 3 questions together. Okay. Oh, he answered it. Perfect. Super. So 2 questions together now. Please.
I got it on. Okay. My name is Samah Salman. I'm from Sudan's private sector. I also work in various advocacy groups. My question is similar to the last lady's question, and I think I just wanted to add something quickly to her, is that our experience is that we have the problem of blood gold in Sudan, which is large militia groups who are actually leading the theft and smuggling of gold in mines in Sudan, which then go through, loaded on planes, go to the United Arab Emirates, and then go to Russia, part of it which is fueling the war in Ukraine. And these are deals cut largely with Prigozhin, which is one of the Putin's right-hand man and his chef. So if you trace some of these small players, you'll find that they are connected to big militia leaders, and then they are could be connected to systems and supply chains across the world. One tool that we've used is advocacy, and we apply pressure for targeted sanctions. And we've been doing that, and to some extent it's been working. So it's something that you could think about. It's difficult, but... So my question is, in the oil and gas sector in Sudan, there's probably about $8 billion worth of oil that's been stolen over the last 10 years, if not more. And currently about 50% of Sudan's gold gets smuggled annually. 50 to 60% are the estimates in the way that I just mentioned. These systems, I think, work in instances, it works to help raise transparency, but in nations that are just so, at the moment, in terms of their governance and leadership, need a lot of work, like the revolution that we've been working on. What kind of due diligence mechanisms do you have for recovery of stolen assets once these assets have been stolen? If you could speak about those processes, I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
That's fantastic. Thank you. And also raising the issue of the transnational challenges. Please.
Who is the next?
I thought that you were going to.
No, I'll help you with the mic.
Oh, fantastic. There's in the back. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Badji Koulibaly. I'm from Mali. I work by Mali National Anti-Corruption Agency. So I'm very delighted to have this topic. So in terms of service and goods providing in those extractive industries, we should keep in mind that all the problems, this is by the government side. It's not because the fact that you are being paid taxes that you should blindfold not to keep eye on those extractive industries. It's not fair. Government should set up appropriate service to have a look on all kinds of contracts and tenders. This is the only solution. Thanks.
Much appreciated for that contribution. Any reactions from the panel to the two comments that we just got?
I guess I'll go with that one first. I mean, in general, 100% the government has to do more. And if you look at the countries that have succeeded in increasing local procurement, it's been through government intervention. There's not a single developing country which has essentially said, let's just let the market, go where it goes. The countries that are doing well, for example, the Gulf states in local content right now, Norway in the past, it's because they put in interventions and combining demand-side policies in terms of requiring companies to buy locally. They were supported by supply-side policies, which said, we are going to invest in supplier development. We are going to have a national fund, for example, for suppliers. So 100% this will not sort itself out unless the government gets heavily involved in supporting these suppliers. That involves the efficient use of tax revenue towards that end. For the question about the smuggling in Sudan, and I guess I can also answer the ASM question to some extent, and it's not going to be a very satisfying answer at all. But look, these countries need economic development, period. All this other stuff, all this stuff, including this, helps a lot. But ultimately, unless you make it a better bargain to go straight, business-wise, it's always going to be incentive to do wrong things. And I'll use an example from ASM. I was able to visit a mine in the Congo one time, and a colleague of mine from grad school was the community relations lead. And they said, okay, well, she had all this money from the company and pressure from her bosses to say, you need to do alternative livelihoods programs because all these illegal miners are on our concession and they're hacking away at our tailings and everything else. And she said to me that, bluntly, these people have no idea what they're talking about because growing vegetables with an alternative livelihood project makes $300 a month, and illegal gold mining pays $2,000. Nothing, no certification system, no due diligence process, nothing will make a difference as long as it's $1,700 more per month to illegally mine than it is to grow vegetables. So the point is that we need, again, this is not satisfying because you can't just make industrial development happen, but we need to be realistic that in a lot of these countries, these are necessary but not sufficient tools to overcome these challenges. And I think, and what I would argue is that procurement is one of those pieces. There are high-paying jobs in supplier businesses for mining, for example, which then might say, maybe I'll work for that supplier firm instead of working for or doing illegal mining. But again, it's a much wider scale, and I think we do all have to be humble that a lot of these certification systems, in whatever the topic, will not actually solve this without that larger problem being solved.
Rob or Gosia?
I just wanted to jump in on the first point about government involvement. And I just want to back up everything that Jeff said, but then also to add the point that I think this is actually even more of an imperative now for governments to get involved to support local procurement, especially with since the pandemic, we've seen increased automation of supplier activities. We've seen increased use of remote workers. So a big company based maybe in the US or Europe actually providing remote services to a mine site halfway around the world. And given this sort of technological sort of advance, this just further sort of eats into the possibility of local value creation and support of local supply chains. So really, really important for policy to sort of step in and address that issue.
2 quick questions, mindful of the time, and then I'll give a minute to each member of the panel for wrapping up.
There are some online questions apparently. I don't have them.
Okay, we'll look after these 2 questions really quick online. What do we have? Absolutely, please.
TI Kazakhstan, my name is Aydar Gubayev. In UK, there is a Modern Slavery Act, and some of the suppliers have top companies residing in UK. In the oil-rich countries where they have contracts, they may outsource services, and these subcontractors may have the cases of modern slavery, but the Modern Slavery Act wouldn't apply to those subcontractors, although the whole liability is with the original supplier, UK supplier. Do you see what I mean? The chances that the local person who suffered from the Modern Slavery Act, from Slavery Act, has very low chances of proving it and of making the actual supplier liable, because he's with a subcontractor. So there is this legal cut of liability, conscious or not, but it's very convenient. What do you make of it?
I think this is a really important issue and something that we need to be really mindful of when you're advocating for more scrutiny of suppliers. Ultimately, the people who should be held responsible, I think, for what happens in the supply chain should be the people at the top of the supply chain. So when we're talking about a mining project or an oil project, you should be thinking about the exploration and production company that runs that project, and then the suppliers sort of should, they ultimately sort of. They report to that company, but if there's wrongdoing in that supply chain, that company needs to take responsibility for that. So I just want to stress that as we're talking about we need more scrutiny of these suppliers. We don't want to in any way while we're doing that sort of divert that responsibility away from that prime company in these supply chains. I can't speak directly to the intricacies of the UK Bribery Act, and my understanding is that it would apply, or it should apply to all the companies within the supply chain, but I don't know the sort of legal intricacies there exactly. So.
Just a quick, I think, to me, when hearing this, the first thing that comes to mind is the apparel sector and the traceability that exists in that supply chain, and the sort of, both driven by consumers and also by the governments, but, whether it's a test, not only apparel, but, whether it's Nike and who their suppliers are all through the supply chain, they're going and auditing the factories, or that's what I understand. So, and it goes down to the sort of second and third tier suppliers. So I think it's a matter of whoever is creating this reporting requirement or policy needs to follow that track, just like Rob is saying.
We have one more question here. Thank you so much, sir. And then I'm going to acknowledge and quickly read the comments that we have from the chat. And we may follow up after the event because we are running out of time, which is a great thing to have. I really love having that problem. Thank you very much for that interest. Please, sir.
Thank you very much. My name is Hamid Sharif. I'm the head of integrity at the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. I have first of all, thank you for the panel, excellent presentations and great insights. I have two questions. One is local procurement reporting mechanism. It's a great mechanism, but as we know from the MDB experience, and MDBs put a lot of emphasis on procurement, but they actually have mechanisms to exercise oversight. Now, this is simply reporting. What is there for a company to just misreport? I mean, in procurement, even with MDB oversight, most of our integrity violations actually come from procurement, despite the huge oversight which we exercise. So here, there's no mechanism, so the incentives for misreporting are very high. My second question is that in some of these concessions, you may have the government actually retaining ownership, a certain percentage, and they may appoint their own directors. And it's not inconceivable that in some of these jurisdictions, the directors, the security agencies, the custom agencies may all be involved in misreporting the extraction going on. So if you're getting out 100 barrels or 100 tons of gold, you could easily represent that to be 50% of that, and you would deprive the country of tax revenues and other benefits. So how do you tackle these? Thank you.
Have a quick response to that, please.
I guess I'll try to answer both at the same time. I mean, this is only a means towards, this is I guess, one of the many frameworks that should be used. But I mean, my argument would be we just need more enforcement, that if you do, for example, lie in your reporting, I mean, I think there should be consequences. I mean, we don't have that even in any ESG reporting right now. Right now, even the most advanced ESG reporting requirements being considered, for example, by the EU right now, I don't believe there's any idea that if you lie in your ESG report, you'll face a fine. I mean, that would be a solution, I think, to be honest. That would be where we can get to. Right now, we have a situation where I'm on the Global Reporting Initiative's mining sector standard, and a working group, and there's always this discussion about the reporting burden, right? I don't understand why, as a society, we make it that you must report in great detail, a great burden to do that on financial reporting, but on societal impact, we don't. We just say that's sort of almost like a nice to have. I think we need to have this kind of reporting for ESG, for sustainability, for due diligence should be taken as seriously by regulators and by criminal regulations as financial reporting. I think that would be a solution. But yes, 100%, all these tools, the Global Reporting Initiative is another perfect example. It's a great tool, but there's no consequences if you lie in your GRI report. I mean, there just isn't. So I agree, these are sort of the frameworks we need to report, but then it needs to be coupled with actual enforcement, that if you don't, or if you're dishonest, you should face a sanction. So,
Rob?
Yeah, I mean, I would just add on that response that this isn't the panacea, the only tool in your arsenal. Like, the reason that we need reporting is also for a whole range of other issues. Like in most countries, it's impossible to even know sort of like how much money is being spent on suppliers. So like, how do you then develop like reasonable policies for local supplier development, for example? You can't do that unless you have that ballpark figure. So what we're talking about is trying to answer those kinds of questions. And then also at the same time, then you understand sort of things like, say, corruption risks, like how big is, what's at stake. So I would just say, we need to be modest as well and understand, what it is that, how far these sort of transparency solutions can go. But I do think as part of a broader package, they're very, very important. And just on your question regarding, making, valuing how much quantities of minerals leave the country, etc. I mean, that's something that the government tax authorities do in tax audits and things like that of materials. And there are processes sort of for monitoring that, and it depends on the sort of administration of the country in question, how well those are followed. But yeah, that's quite there's sort of standardized processes there.
Great. We are wrapping up, but I wanted to acknowledge the questions from the chat. There were 3, right? One, we were talking before about beneficial ownership, right? But specifically the role that it can play in helping extractive companies check, for example, that local content providers really are locally owned. That was by Tim Law. Michael Barron sent a question. Given the vast number and variety of companies in supply chains, where should anti-corruption efforts be focused, for example, using a materiality threshold, and how will that be set, right? Also, what counts as company in the supply chain For example, companies that supply services like insurance, accountants, lawyers, HSE, risk management, etc. Right? Like something to consider. We have talked so much also about enablers during this conference. I mean, like, how do we connect these conversations? And then I just finally wanted to wrap up with acknowledging also the question from Edmond Reed in Liberia, right? And where it's basically an invocation, right? Like, while the gold and diamond extracted from Liberia are sent to developed countries around the world with good laws, and these countries remain less corrupt, what are those developed countries doing to help the developing countries like Liberia to implement good laws so that the developing countries can benefit from their materials, really? I mean, like, this is really an invocation. We have seen, and I guess that was part of the point of today, like how complex the issue is, how many ramifications and connections to other of the challenges that we have been talking about this week, and others that we may not have touched deep enough, right? And this should be humbling for us as a community, but also a very important call of action, right? Like, we need to work together more. We need to find ways to collaborate, to cross information, to push further and not be complacent also. I guess that there has been a lot of progress in this area. There has been a lot of fight, and you guys have put a lot of effort in all that, and that should be recognized. But obviously, right, like the fight is on, right? And there's still a lot of work to do. In stopping, in reducing, in preventing, in changing the mindsets that justify and allow for corruption to happen in the extractive sector. I want to thank you very much, our panel today. I will ask you for a round of applause for them and for you. For you and those that follow us online, thank you for being patient and participating so actively of this. Thank you. Enjoy the last day of the conference.